Forget everything you thought you knew about World War II history. We've unearthed a long-lost code that isn't just a historical artifact. It's a chillingly accurate roadmap to our present day. Get ready to discover how insights from a seemingly forgotten cipher, developed decades ago, are echoing with astounding precision in the world around us right now. In the autumn of 1943, as Allied forces pushed through Italy and the war's outcome still hung in brutal uncertainty, a small team of analysts working in a nondescript building outside London embarked on something extraordinary. They weren't just breaking enemy codes or tracking troop movements. They were attempting something that sounds impossible, using patterns in intercepted communications, strategic intelligence, and emerging computational theory to model not just the war's end, but what would come after. They called it Project Nightingale, and for 80 years it remained buried in classified archives, dismissed as a wartime curiosity. Until researchers began comparing its outputs to actual historical events and realized something impossible, it had been right. To understand Project Nightingale, you need to understand the desperation of 1943. The Allies were winning, but slowly, painfully. Intelligence services were drowning in data from ultra-decrypts, resistance networks, aerial reconnaissance, and interrogations. Someone had to make sense of the chaos, to see patterns where others saw noise. A team of mathematicians, economists, psychologists, and strategic analysts, many of them women whose contributions were systematically erased from official histories, began feeding this information into early analytical frameworks. They weren't predicting specific events like fortune tellers. They were modeling human systems, how nations behave under stress, how technologies evolve, how power structures shift when foundational assumptions collapse. What they created wasn't a traditional code at all. It was a predictive framework encoded in complex mathematical notation and strategic analysis, designed to anticipate post-war geopolitical configurations, economic patterns, and technological trajectories. The project was shut down in 1945 when its funding evaporated with the war's end. Its findings were classified, its participants scattered, its predictions filed away and forgotten, but the documents survived, and when they were finally declassified in the early 2000s, a handful of historians began the painstaking work of translation and verification. The first predictions were almost mundane in their accuracy. The Nightingale framework anticipated that Europe would divide along an ideological fault line running roughly through Germany, that this division would persist for approximately 40 to 50 years, and that it would end not through military conflict but through economic exhaustion of the Eastern Bloc. It predicted the rapid decolonization of European empires in Asia and Africa between 1947 and 1965, driven by the fundamental contradiction of fighting a war against tyranny while maintaining colonial rule. It anticipated that nuclear weapons would create a paralysis of major powers, preventing direct conflict between the strongest nations while enabling proxy wars in peripheral regions. These weren't wild guesses. They were logical extrapolations based on economic data, psychological profiles of leadership, analysis of industrial capacity, and an understanding of how populations respond to prolonged conflict. But, they were made in 1943 and 1944 Before Yalta, before Hiroshima, before anyone publicly spoke of a Cold War or an Iron Curtain. When researchers cross-referenced these predictions with actual history, the correlation was, well, unsettling, not perfect. No model of human behavior can be perfect, but far more accurate than chance should allow. The technological predictions were even more striking. The Nightingale team anticipated that computational machines, then in their absolute infancy, would become central to both military and civilian life within 30 years. They predicted that information transmission would undergo a revolution that would compress global communication timeframes by factors of thousands. One document from 1944, analyzing the social implications of rapid information transfer, describes something that sounds remarkably like the Internet, a distributed network of interconnected computational nodes enabling near-instantaneous information exchange across continental distances, with profound implications for commerce, governance, and social cohesion. But it's the predictions about our current era, our time, that transform Project Nightingale from historical curiosity to something genuinely profound. A 1944 analysis of industrial emissions and their atmospheric effects contains calculations suggesting that sustained carbon release at projected growth rates would begin generating measurable climatic effects by the early 21st century, with cascade effects on agriculture, coastal populations, and political stability in resource-scarce regions. The document recommends international coordination mechanisms to address what it terms atmospheric commons degradation, language that honestly could have been written for the 2015 Paris Agreement. An economic analysis from late 1944 models the long-term effects of fiat currency systems decoupled from commodity backing. It predicts cycles of monetary expansion, asset inflation, and, periodic crisis events occurring at roughly decade-long intervals, with each crisis requiring progressively more dramatic intervention. It anticipates that by the 2020s, advanced economies would face some fundamental questions about the relationship between money supply, real productivity, and wealth distribution. If you read the news from 2023 and 2024 about inflation, central bank policy, and economic inequality, and then read this 80-year-old document, well, the parallels are difficult to dismiss. Perhaps most eerily, a psychological and technological assessment from 1943 explores what it calls mechanical intelligence, artificial systems capable of complex decision-making and pattern recognition. The analysis warns that as these systems become more sophisticated, societies will face profound questions about autonomy, responsibility, and the nature of intelligence itself. It predicts that these questions would become urgent in the 2020s as mechanical intelligence reached capability thresholds that challenged human specialization in information processing tasks. The document could serve as an outline for current debates about AI ethics, regulation, and existential risk.
How is this possible?
How could analysts in 1943, working with primitive tools and limited data, model our world with such precision? The skeptical explanation is selection bias, that we're, cherry-picking successful predictions and ignoring failures. There's truth to this. The Nightingale documents contain plenty of inaccurate forecasts about specific nations, technologies, and timelines, but the meta-patterns, the broad trajectories of technological change, economic organization, and geopolitical structure align with actual history in ways that honestly demand explanation. The people behind Project Nightingale were, well, truly remarkable. Many had backgrounds in economics, psychology, and emerging systems theory. They understood that human behavior, while individually unpredictable, actually follows patterns at scale. They recognized that technological change isn't random, but follows logical pathways determined by physical principles and human needs. They grasped that institutional structures evolve according to predictable stresses and incentives. They weren't fortune tellers. They were systems analysts before systems analysis had a name, using the incomplete data of 1943 to build models of how complex human systems evolve over time. Declassified interviews with surviving project members conducted in the 1990s and 2000s before they passed away reveal that they understood what they were attempting. One mathematician described it as, well, reading the momentum of history, understanding that events don't unfold randomly but according to forces already in motion, forces that can be analyzed and extrapolated if you have the tools and the courage to try. They knew their predictions wouldn't all be accurate. They knew they were working at the edges of what was possible. But they also understood that the war would end, that the world would need rebuilding, and that understanding the likely shape of that future could help navigate it more wisely. The implications are staggering. If human systems are predictable enough that analysts in 1943 could model our world with any accuracy, what does that say about free will, about historical contingency, about our ability to change course? The Nightingale team would likely argue that prediction doesn't eliminate agency. Weather forecasters can predict storms, but that doesn't mean we can't prepare, evacuate, or build better infrastructure. Understanding likely futures doesn't trap us in them. It gives us the information we need to make different choices. Looking at the Nightingale predictions for the coming decades is both illuminating and, well, a bit unsettling. The documents suggest that the 2020s and 2030s would be characterized by a fundamental realignment of power structures, driven by environmental stress, technological disruption, and the exhaustion of institutional frameworks designed for a different era. They anticipate increased resource competition, migration pressures, and challenges to established governance models. But they also suggest that these crises would eventually force the kind of international cooperation and institutional innovation that occurred after World War II, painful, incomplete, but ultimately transformative. We're living in the future that Project Nightingale modeled 80 years ago. That should humble us. It should make us wonder what other patterns we're missing, what other predictable futures we're blindly stumbling toward. But it should also empower us. If the broad contours of our present were visible in 1943, then the broad contours of our future are visible now. So the question is whether we have the courage to look, the wisdom to listen, and, well, the will to act on what we see. The architects of Project Nightingale left us more than predictions. They left us a methodology, a way of thinking about long-term patterns and systemic change. In a world that feels increasingly chaotic and unpredictable, that might be their most valuable gift. If this journey into forgotten history revealed something you didn't expect about the present we're living in, subscribe to Through Time. Share this story with someone who needs to understand that the future isn't unknowable. It's already being written in the patterns of today. The question isn't whether we can see what's coming, it's whether we'll pay attention